In this video, I'm going to explain camera metering modes. That's metering for exposure. And I'm also going to explain to you how you can solve the most common problem you will come across with the wrong metering. That's when your photo turns out like this. The background looks perfectly exposed, but your subject is too dark. Or you might get a situation where it's the opposite way round and the subject is very bright, but the background is exposed perfectly. I'll show you how to solve that by choosing the right metering mode. Welcome to Nifty 50 Photographers. I'm Richard Gill. I'm a professional photographer, and on this channel we provide training videos for people who are a little bit older, maybe with some grey in their hair or maybe not much hair left at all, on how to use your camera, how to get the best out of it, how to compose and edit your photos. Now, if that sounds like you, then make sure you hit the subscribe button and come and join our community. Right, let's get straight into it. So what are the different metering modes on your camera? So I'm going to explain these on two cameras, a Sony a7 III and a Nikon D7000. Let's have a look at the metering modes on the Sony a7 III. So we'll go into the menu. And you see the first one is called multi. Now this is also called matrix on Nikon's and I think evaluative on Canon. And what this does is it looks at a complicated algorithm to try and come up with the best exposure possible. And this is the mode your camera will be in by default generally, and actually it's the best mode to use, and it's the one I use most of the time, and I only switch to others when I'm not getting the results I want. So that's my top tip for you. Leave it in this multi-mode and then change when you don't get the results you want. So the next one is center weighted. And sometimes it's called center weighted average, and just as its name implies, the camera is going to put most emphasis on what is in the center of your frame. Now this isn't a mode I use very often, but where you would use it is if you're doing a lot of photojournalism type stuff, so documentary style photography where you're telling a story and most of your shots will be of one particular subject and you're filling the frame with that subject, then center weighted might work very well for you because it's what's in the center of your photo that you want to be perfectly exposed. Now the next one is spot, and the standard there is for the size of the spot. On some cameras you can alter the size of that spot. You see I can make it large or standard in my case. You might not have that option on yours, but you should have those three metering modes. So that's the matrix or evaluative, a center weighted and a spot. Now spot works in exactly the same way, but instead of it being in the center, you can move it around your frame and choose which thing you actually want to be correctly exposed. And the camera will look at whatever your focus point is to decide what its exposure would be. So you might well use this for things like portraits, where you want to ensure that the skin of the person you're photographing is perfectly exposed. Now I have a couple of other options, in fact 3 other options on the Sony, which you certainly won't get on every camera. But here is the next one. This is the entire screen average, and basically what they mean actually is the entire scene you're looking at, and it's just going to average out the light it's measuring from that entire scene. So it's a bit like the evaluative, but it's not putting any emphasis anywhere, it's just averaging the entire scene. I don't think I've ever used that. I can see the advantage of it is if you've got maybe a studio setup and you're moving people around, then it doesn't really matter that you move them because the average scene lighting hasn't changed. And then finally I have a highlight option, and this is I think slightly confusingly named. It doesn't mean it's exposing for the brightest part of the scene. what it means is it's going to put emphasis on an area that you've highlighted in the scene. Again, it's not something I use. I default to the matrix or multi-scene mode, and then the other one I use a lot more is spot. So on the Nikon, I access the metering from this button here, and by pressing that and then turning the command dial at the back here, I can change the metering mode. So same symbol as before. So this is your evaluative, matrix or multi-metering. The next option is a spot metering. And finally, there is the center weighted or center weighted average metering. And they work just in the same way as they did on the Sony in those three different modes. So what did your camera think is a correct exposure? Well, actually what it's looking for is to make the scene what they call 18% grey. It's sort of mid-grey like this. This is a grey card that photographers use for calibrations of things like white balance and making sure they get the correct exposure. Now, you don't have to worry about knowing what 18% grey is, but what you've got to imagine is take your whole scene, look at all the lights and darks in it, so the highlights and the shadows, average all that out and try and imagine that turning out to be an average colour, which is that sort of grey which I just showed you. Now, the reason I wanted you to understand that is because when you pick particularly things like a spot metering point and you don't get quite the right result, it's because the spot you've found isn't going to translate to that 18% grey. If you want a rule of thumb of something that looks 18% grey, then look for some lush green grass. That nearly always comes out pretty close to that colour. Now, I promised to show you what happens when your camera gets it wrong. So let's go and do a setup where that is very likely to happen, and that's usually the most common one is where you have a strong backlight. So come and follow me and we'll go and look at that. I've set up a scene that is very typical of where your camera's metering might get it wrong, especially if you've defaulted to that matrix or evaluative mode. We've got a very strong backlight behind our good old friend Scooby-Doo. And the camera, if it was in evaluative mode, is going to look at the whole scene. So let's get that, see what goes wrong, and then see how to put it right. So here's our camera ready to take the shot, and there's our shot. See, it's done quite a good job, but to be honest, I think Scooby-Doo's face is looking a little bit on the dark side. So let's try the same again, but this time let's use a different mode. Let's try center. Now Scooby-Doo is pretty much in the center of our frame, but actually the circle that the camera is going to choose is much bigger than just his sort of nose and face. So I think it'll still underexpose it. Let's see if I'm right. Looks a little bit better, but his nose is still underexposed. Now, if I wanted to frame this differently, with Scooby-Doo off to one side, then obviously center wouldn't work at all. And I would need to use the next mode, which is spot. But let's just first show you the difference with spot, where Scooby-Doo is still in the center of the frame. So, and I've lined up my spot right onto his smiling face there. So let's take that shot. And you can see now the exposure is better because spot actually looks at a much smaller area. And I can, on the Sony, actually change the size of that spot. But I've got it set to the standard size, so it's just focusing right on his face. Now let's change the composition and just try that again. Actually, that's looking pretty good. It's got the exposure right for his face. Background is obviously overexposed. So that's how to get round it when you've got a strongly backlit subject. Now you should have no problems taking a backlit photograph and getting it properly exposed. Why not share some of them on the Nifty 50 Photographers Facebook page? I'll put a link in the description below. And if you're enjoying these videos, I'd really appreciate your feedback. Am I covering the kind of topics you're interested in? Is it helpful to you? And am I going too fast or too slow? Or maybe it's just right. Do let me know in the comments. Finally, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. And also, if you like this video, I'd appreciate if you give that a like as well. If you're wondering what to do next, then check out this playlist. There are lots of great videos there that'll help you to get to grips with all the different functions of your camera and get the best out of it. I look forward to seeing you next time.